My name is Carmen. I am an investor at Samaipata. I lead the UK office there. Basically, Samaipata is a pre-seed, seed stage VC fund, investing only in marketplaces and digital brands. We're a thematic by business model, and we only invest in marketplaces and digital brands. If you think about it, there are two reasons. One is that we need to build expertise if we want to add value, but ultimately as an investment thesis, if you think about it, it's because we invest in defensibility, because we believe that defensibility is the main driver of long-term value. Now, in marketplaces, defensibility can be made up of mainly three modes, how we look at it. One is network effects, and there are very different ways to classify a network effect. But basically, the very basic idea is that when a new user joins, the value that the service or product the company is providing to the new and existing users increases. And that's absolutely kind of the key driver of defensibility for us. So we always, you could even say that we actually invest in network effects, not even marketplaces only. Now, another way to assess defensibility is to look at the power of the brand. We really believe that emotional connection that you establish with your customer is a barrier of entry. It's a very strong barrier of entry. You need to create that community, that sense of belonging to be defensible against competitors. And third, last but not least, is switching costs. So either because the more you've used a platform or product, the more personalized it is, the better is the UX. It's just, you kind of create barriers of entry for your people to leave. On defensibility, it's very important to understand that we look at it from the demand and the supply side, not just the demand. You need to build a defensible supply, especially if you are a service marketplace, right? Because without that supply, you cannot provide an experience. Now, we don't like models where your supply is only defensible based on cash, like it happens, for example, in Uber. Because if you have a better funded competitor, they will steal away your supply. With no supply, no experience. And if you want to compete and get the supply, the issue you're going to have is your unit economics might stop working. So you need to build a defensible supply. It's absolutely key. Now, also, and the second factor that we look at on top of defensibility would be scalability. And again, that comes back to demand and supply as well. So scalability takes different sources. But first of all, is your total addressable market on the demand side, is it big enough? And is there enough depth of supply? Can you build a business big enough with the supply that you're gonna need? And how are you gonna acquire that demand and that supply? And there we look at the typical unit economics. And then third, what are the processes, right? Like the onboarding. Can you really create a scalable onboarding process that keeps the quality of the supply in this case, right? So I think scalability is key and another concern. And then third, and we are very, very focused on this as investors, is retention and engagement. I always say, if they will ask me for one single metric that I look at, it's the cohorts. We look at cohorts both on retention and engagement. So we look at both the Q, the quantity, and the R, the repetition. And that's absolutely fundamental on the supply and on the demand side again. Also, a problem that especially on-demand and service marketplaces have a big problem is leakage. Because as soon as the interaction is human, there's this temptation from the supply and the demand to take the transaction off the platform. So we look at cohorts to understand how that's doing, but then we also try to figure out ways, and many of them are very sector specific, that you can ways that you can add additional value to the supply and demand to disincentivize that leakage, right? It might be, for example, in the case of Airbnb, insurance is a great one. but that doesn't work on everyone. Others create SaaS tools to remove the admin trouble. So how do you make sure that the transaction happens on the platform is absolutely key as well. So I think that would be the key three: defensibility, scalability, and retention and engagement, the key three things. It's a very good question, and I'm happy you asked, because I actually wrote that post about, I developed a customer love framework, so to say. I think it's very interesting to understand that some people think the brand is something intangible, and it is intangible, but it's customer behavior, and ultimately you can measure it. So there are a lot of metrics that you can look at. So cohorts is an amazing indication. If your customers want your product, they're coming back and they're buying more and more, there's clearly a brand going on. If another one is obviously if your organic acquisition goes down, there's word of mouth, there's virality, people are telling their friends for free, that also shows the power of the brand. And what that translates into is that your blended customer acquisition cost goes down, right? So you have the acquisition side and then you have the retention side. And there are many other softer ways to look at. I personally check Instagram. I check Instagram engagement because the followers is a vanity metric. You need to check the comments, how engaged, to get a feel of how engaged is that community, right? Is there really that sense of belonging? And they're great examples of powerful brands. You have Glossier in the US who, through content, created a trusted community around them, and then you can sell them anything, So the idea of creating brands is very important, because also if you think about it now, how we order food, we order from restaurants, but it's Deliveroo in our case, or Uber Eats that we are actually ordering from, right? So they're providing a branded experience that they don't always control, which is another challenge. You need to make sure because that the experience is perfectly on brand. Well, there are many that are related to startups in general, but if I had to think about two actually, from marketplaces, is first of all, not to think about your supply hard enough, to just be very focused on the demand side. And then second and most common is the lack of liquidity. And this is also about how you approach the launch, right? In our thesis, we like founders that have a very clear differentiation between their go-to-market and their vision. And the vision can be to own Europe, I don't mind, but your go-to-market should be saturate nodes. You need to saturate nodes and create liquidity there, and then kind of replicate that playbook, right? I think Deliveroo is a great example. They launched in Chelsea, which is a tiny neighborhood in London, and proved there, because when you need liquidity, especially in those marketplaces that need liquidity, if you aim at launching, even if it's just London overall, and I go into a beauty app, for example, and want to book nails, and I get into the app and there's no liquidity, you've lost me, but you've paid for me. So the risk is very high. So my advice will always be focus, saturate nodes, and then expand. It's tempting to go very big from the beginning, but and the third thing that's also not said enough, and it's not necessarily only on marketplaces, but it's very important for founders, is be data-driven from minute one. I always ask every founder I meet, and I am gonna do analysis on, to provide me with a KPI dashboard that they use to look at the business. And I don't need to be linked to the software, and I don't even need it to be super updated at that time. I just need to understand how they're looking at the business. Because data-driven decisions are better decisions. And if you don't do it from the beginning, if you don't build a very data-driven business, it's very tough down the road, right? And you need to be able to understand where you're putting the money, the impact that that's having, and iterate accordingly. So, yeah.